Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, Billy, when I first started asking about this topic, it was like we were having flooding and snow and you name it. The weather was just crazy. So I thought, wonder how this is affecting our wildlife. So then I've got some people together and we're going to do that. And we're also doing another topic as well.
Yeah, fortunately, we have some really great resources here in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. First, glad to have you all with us today. Thanks for joining us on From the Woods today. Really excited about today's show. Yeah, as you said, Renee, we talked about extreme weather, right? And we've certainly seen our share of extreme weather here in Kentucky,
This year.
and an increasing amount of extreme weather. When you have a 1,000-year flood every couple of years, you're like, so things are pretty extreme, right?
Right.
But fortunately, we do have a couple of really good professors here that are going to be talking about its impact on wildlife. And you might imagine, wildlife don't have like little territories where they have to stay, right? It's not like the same boundaries that humans use, so they're everywhere. So
they can't go in the house and turn the heat on.
Exactly.
Well, I guess they can, but we might kick them out.
I have Dr. John Cox on. He's been on the show with us before. He really is a wildlife professor here, does a lot with mammals, but he's going to be talking generally about kind of some of the impacts of extreme weather on wildlife, how it impacts their behavior and their survivability and all of that great stuff. And then we're also going to have Dr. DJ McNeil on with kind of a special edition of Wings of Kentucky, talking about the extreme weather impacts on birds, focusing on that. And then we've got Chad Nyman's coming in, and we've got this really cool conference coming up on Friday, Mass Timber in Appalachia, a conference that Chad's been organizing with a lot of folks here on campus, bringing in world-class experts. So Chad will be talking about that, but he'll also be talking about mass timber. This is a really amazing opportunity to utilize a lot of our wood here in Kentucky, especially some of our lower quality wood or lower grade wood. So Chad's been working on this for a long time. So really excited for Chad to have this big conference here at the University of Kentucky looking at mass timber. So we're going to have a great day today. So if you all have got any questions for our presenters, please use the chat function. And if you're a YouTube or podcast listener, you can always hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu, and we can respond that way. But Renee, really glad to be with you and really excited about getting today's show going.
Definitely. So let's go ahead. So Dr. Cox, if you'd like to join us.
Greetings.
Welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to have you, sir. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
We really appreciate you doing this. We've had so many different weather events this year within the last year, and it sparked my interest as like, well, what are these wildlife doing? And like, are they getting cold? Are they getting, it's like, what is the extreme temperatures? Even, I guess, even heat, could make them, do different things. So I thought, well, let's let the experts let us know what's going on with that.
Okay, yeah, so let's talk about some wildlife responses to extreme weather. What I'm going to try to do here is help you all sort of conceptualize how wildlife might perceive and how they might react to these extreme weather events, and maybe a few adaptations that they've got here and there sprinkled in there.
Okay. Looking forward
to it.
Okay, so what I would like to do first is try to link in your mind that we need to think about these extreme weather events as really some forms of disturbance. And when we think about disturbance, we need to think about the type of disturbance. So are we talking about extreme temperature swings? Are we talking about ice storms, big snowfalls, big rain events, flood, fire, drought, wind? These are all the sort of the things that wildlife deal with on a daily or yearly basis. And for most wildlife species, they're used to what we would consider a typical kind of event, and they've adapted to those different communities with these sort of regularity of these kinds of events. But then we get into these atypical events, and these are events basically where we define them as being very intense. They have maybe an unusual duration, or they have an unusual spatial scale, so they're much larger than typically occurs. And they may occur during times of the year that these wildlife are not well adapted. And so the kind of responses that we see from wildlife are really happen on a short-term and long-term basis in terms of their adaptability to these things. So just like wildlife, we've got this climatic envelope, and that basically means what is sort of our temperature tolerance range. what's our, the high temperature that we can tolerate and live in a city, or the precipitation or the humidity or the amount of rainfall, both on the high end and low end. And, we're all adapted to sort of this average kind of event. And what happens with these extreme events, let's just take very hot conditions, for example, is that if we have an extended hot spell, that is going to shift sort of the probability that you're going to experience heat that sort of takes you out of your comfort zone, and it may lead to long-term problems, including even death. So we can see that with precipitation. We can see that with wind events and other kinds of things too that really take us out of our comfort zone. When we think about responses, one of the first things that comes to people's mind is like what directly happens to these animals. Like, do they die from these events? And in some cases, we do see direct mortality. I mean, it's just beyond the norms, and that wildlife can't deal with it. In the short term, we can see movement-based responses. So those are things like just moving out of these disturbed areas. We can see more longer-term displacement where they seek refuge for longer periods of time. And then extreme cases, we will see immigration. So movement completely out of the area for extended or, maybe forever periods of time. And we actually will see species shift their entire range. And we do see that happening globally with a lot of these extreme kinds of weather events. We see habitat alterations, and these things are, things that alter food, shelter, water. In some cases, we see short-term habitat loss. So, there will be species there that just cannot deal with these extreme weather events in terms of how they've impacted habitat. But there are species that benefit from that. So they can actually step into these disturbed areas and they can gain from that. And we see that in the longer term as well. We see physiological responses both in short term and chronic stress, chronic nutritional changes, hormonal changes. All of these things are things that are just part of our, organismal responses to these things. And then I would say in the intermediate to the long term, we can see what we call demographic changes. So things like birth rates and death rates, and whether or not animals stay or they go away, or do we have new species that come into these areas? So when we think about these climate events, these extreme weather events, we need to understand that that is going to shift the different habitat stages around. It's going to shuffle them, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in a grassland and we've got a fire or a drought that shifts things back to bare soil, or it drives them to a very diverse set of forbs and grasses. Over time, if it becomes stable and we get lots of rainfall and we get blooms and that sort of thing. With forests, we see tornadoes and hurricanes and fires that will drive a forest back to early successional stages. That can be very beneficial for some species, and then it's very detrimental for more old growth kinds of species. And even in wetlands, we have the winners and losers. So the temporary wetlands that might occur after a heavy rainfall can benefit things like amphibians and some, wading birds. And then we get permanent droughts, which can drive these species in ways that shift their entire ranges if they're severe enough. So let's look at some of these events and just talk about some of the different responses. So with freezes, in many cases, when we've got ice that is locking up food sources, that can just make it difficult to access by a number of species, including birds, but other critters too. I think a lot of people don't realize that one of the limiting factors in the wintertime is the availability of freestanding water. So, winter is often a time when we get kind of desiccated and dry out, and a lot of animals are looking for, freestanding water to drink. And when we got a big freeze like that, it's pretty hard to come by. And that can be very deleterious to species. We see hormonal shifts and behavioral shifts in the physiology of animals like black bears. So we get an extended cold period. Bears may spend much more time in hibernation. That may end up chewing up some more of their fat reserves. But hopefully, they've got enough in there that they can give birth to cubs and they can nurse those cubs. Bats are kind of the same thing. They've only got so much fat that's in the fuel tank when they go into caves during the winter time. And if that winter is very long or we get extended cold snaps, they may end up running out of gas basically and not even making it out of those caves to get to the spring. And then in an interesting case, I think a lot of people don't consider that when we have lakes and rivers that freeze up, that can be an important dispersal opportunity for species. So, in the late 1970s, we had a blizzard, big freeze that locked up a lot of the Ohio River. And we really saw a surge of coyotes come into Kentucky after the late 1970s. Now, they were already here, but it just seemed like that was something that helped facilitate them moving in greater numbers during that period. Deep snow. Well, for some species, it's playtime. I mean, river otters love to play in the snow and have a great time in it, and great to watch those. Bison, on the other hand, well, it's a little bit tougher row to hoe here because they've got to use their massive heads and they've really got to spend a lot of energy just to plow up that snow to get to the forage underneath of it. Foxes, same too. They've got to break through that crust of snow or they got to dive a little deeper to get those rodents out from under the snow. But many of your hoofed animals have a hard time going through deep snow, and it's because they have a lot of weight that is distributed on a very small surface area on their hoof. So we see them having to really spend a lot of energy to create pathways, or like in this case of this photograph, they'll walk single file to kind of save energy through the snows. And that limited movement makes them more vulnerable to predation. So wolves may have an easier time picking off elk and white-tailed deer and caribou and so forth. And that also creates opportunities for scavengers like ravens and eagles and magpies and such. And then in some cases, we've got species with special adaptations to deep snow, like the lynx, who's got these big, fuzzy, wide feet, basically, that allows it to function like snowshoes and be able to catch things like snowshoe hare and other prey species. What about flooding? Well, flooding, we've seen a lot of that recently in Kentucky, and that can be beneficial for aquatic species, for fish, for salamanders, for frogs, because it maintains and helps reconnect waterways. So that's what we call hydrological connectivity. So that's a good thing. It can help them, establish an interchange of populations that allow an enhanced genetic diversity and so forth. In some cases, it can allow the extension of species into new areas. So we see sometimes snakes will end up showing up in counties that they didn't occur. Like we see copperheads in central Kentucky often show up along the Kentucky River boundaries, and that's because they're coming out of southeast Kentucky, okay, where there's tons of copperheads, but they're rarely found in Lexington, Kentucky. Some species have got special adaptations to flooding. So this is not a pile of cinnamon that you see here in the photograph. That is actually a flotilla of red fire ants. And that is an invasive exotic species from Brazil that is now in southern Kentucky. And what's going on here is that these ants are essentially forming a living raft, and that allows them to essentially amphibiously assault the opposing riverbank or whatever that may be. Here's another recent invader to Kentucky, and this one's a little more benign, I think, and that is what we would call the nine-banded armadillo, now known as the Mexican long-nosed armadillo. This species has a cool adaptation that it can inflate its stomach and intestines and basically float across rivers, no problem. And if it decides to, it can always sink to the bottom, and it can use its very strong, heavy claws to basically walk along the bottom of waterways. Now, that connectivity also can be detrimental because when floods hit homes and businesses and cars, and it creates both point source pollution and non-point source pollution, and that can essentially distribute that to waterways and things that can lead to the death and decline of species too. What about drought? Well, droughts can extend for years and they can alter ecosystems in a way that takes decades really to respond, especially if we don't see sort of return to normalcy there. But let's just take forage, for example. If we look at grasslands or pastures and you have an extended drought there, there's a number of herbivores that depend on the quality and the quantity of that pasture. And what you will see is that the following year of a drought, in many cases, things like elk and white-tailed deer, they may not have as good productivity. That means that they don't produce as many calves or fawns, and maybe they have lower survival because the mother was just didn't have enough nutrition, or it wasn't as good as a year where you might have had good rainfall. Droughts increase flammability of forests like we've seen in California and other places in recent years, and that can lead to more intense disturbances in that realm. It can disrupt hydrological connectivity because we're basically losing sections of streams, which are important for amphibians and other wildlife, including the little bitty ephemeral wetlands that can dry up and are often used by amphibians. And then drought, in some cases, will concentrate wildlife to sections of rivers or streams or water holes. That can lead to an increased transmission of disease among different species. It can lead to competition, more predation, or it can lead to more poaching because everything is kind of concentrated in one area. Or you could just kind of bide your time and not have any sweat off your brow if you're something like a spadefoot toad who can just burrow themselves down into the ground for a number of years and just kind of wait out these droughts. And then when it rains, and then they may come out of the ground and breed and lay eggs. Fires, a lot of your communities are adapted to fire to some degree, but the kinds of fires that we have especially seen are a result of infrequent fires, so not naturally frequent enough. So they're very intense. There's often a lot more fuel than would normally be found there, and then this can lead to very deleterious consequences. So normally fires kind of help restore a lot of the nutrients back to the soils. They create habitat diversity and they help kill invasive species and that kind of stuff. But just to give you an example, it's estimated in 2020 when we had all those California fires. So these are fairly well spread out all over the state that it killed about 15% of all mountain lions in the state, which is about 600 cats. And that's just because a lot of them just got cooked in these very hot fires. There was just nowhere to escape in these very rugged lands. Okay, what about storms and winds? Well, tornadoes and hurricanes, they tend to punch gaps in systems. Tornadoes often at very small spatial scales, but they can also leave a sort of a streaky patchiness behind them that knocks down timber and so forth. Hurricanes usually much more extensive. Um, and that habitat fragmentation, that can reduce the ability of a lot of species to occupy that land, especially what we call interior species. So those that thrive in the safety and security of big blocks of habitat. However, a lot of our game species are edge species and they like to have that fragmentation. And that would be deer and turkey. They don't have any problem with that. And that creates new opportunities for foraging and for nesting and that kind of stuff. Okay, so what's pretty cool about wind events in particular is that when you get these massive hurricanes, especially or cyclones, it can lead to what we would call a sweepstake event, and that is these random chance weather events that lead to the picking up basically and dropping down of species to faraway lands. And that can, again, that can be through the air, or we could drive species on basically rafts of down trees and things, and they end up watching shores and sometimes far away, thousands of miles away. We think that that happened around 20 million years ago or so for the mongoose family. There were mongooses are originated in Africa. They ended up in Madagascar, and we got all these mongoose related species that are now in Madagascar as a result of that rafting sweepstakes event. Similar in South America, 35 to 40 million years ago, it appears that primates rafted their way over to South America. And again, if you think about it, over millions of years, these are just sort of small probability events. And most things that get washed out to sea, are not going to survive, but occasionally, it's going to happen. And then in Australia, we have the appearance of rodents about 5 million years ago. And that is, we think, too, from a rafting event from Southeast Asia, whereby these things head over to New Guinea and then eventually they make their way over to Australia. So, it really kind of helps understand the biogeographical patterns that we see globally. And that is from some of these extreme weather events. Now, just quickly here, we can mimic a lot of these extreme weather events through management tools, through fire, through silviculture. We can create fragmentation and gaps, and we can alter habitat trajectories in ways that can be conducive to the kinds of wildlife we want. And that is through various manipulation of forests. We can clear cut it. We can leave shelter woods. We can do single tree harvest and all of those things to mimic different scales and different intensities of weather events. Um, in many cases, with fires and with wind damage, we see the formation of snags, and this is something that we could also create if we wanted to. And again, these are habitat opportunities here. So even, even dead stuff that's standing up or down on the ground can create habitat for cavity nesters like owls, for bats, with black bears, woodpeckers. Okay. Can't think of those trees as something that is not valuable to wildlife because they're actually gold for many species. Brush piles. So when we get this big piles of trees and slash that's fallen down, lots and lots of species use this, and it's a lot of the things that we describe as sort of like aesthetically unpleasing in the short term, like slash piles, are actually things that we encourage landowners to do through best management practices. And brush piles, for example, create great habitat, for rabbits and other species. Forest openings that are caused by tornadoes, well, that's something that elk and white-tailed deer and other herbivores thrive in that kind of stuff. It allows shrubby things to grow. A lot of your soft mass producing berries and so forth grow in these forest openings. So again, these are all things that we encourage landowners to do. And it's just that some of these extreme weather events mimic those on much larger scales. And of course, we're mimicking some of these weather events in turn. All right, that is all I've got. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in through the chat box and I'll try to address those the best I can.
Wonderful. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot to think about on that one for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting how some animals actually benefit by some of these extreme you would think, because a lot of times you're like, oh, nothing can benefit from this awful, thing that's going on. But it's nice to know that some animals could actually benefit from something that happens.
Yeah, it's there's winners. You have to think about habitat as winners and losers, and it's not a win-win for any species when things are at one stage. Something is always waiting in the wings to move into a disturbed area or to be patient and allow things to become much more stable. And a lot of these events just they help basically stimulate species diversity through these changes on both short time scales and large spatial scales and all that kind of stuff.
Dr. Cox, first, thank you for doing that presentation. It's something I think it's on a lot of people who are thinking about that, and Renee, thanks for the idea too. Appreciate that. One question, kind of thinking about woodland owners, we have a lot of private woodland owners here in Kentucky, and they don't really have obviously, any ability to do anything about extreme weather, right? But are there any, things that they can do or be thinking about, is trying to be friendly to wildlife and these, and events or stuff like that? Or you got any thoughts maybe for woodland owners as it relates to, having habitat on their property and, what they can do or not do, I guess, related to some of these events?
Yeah, well, I think in the short term, you just kind of have to roll with it. If it's something that's really major, like a flood or a tornado comes through, and it depends on the size of your property too, is that you have to understand that different things are going to move into that, and it may not be something that you necessarily want to have come in there in the short term. Uh, and so you just kind of have to embrace it for in large part, unless you have a big enough property there that where you have impacts maybe in one area and not the other.
Right. Yeah, it made me think too. I know often we think about invasive species kind of taking advantage, but I'm thinking plants largely here.
Yeah.
When we see these disturbances, or we often see, some of these invasives take advantage of that as well. So I know that's one thing that, we kind of talk to woodland owners about, be on the lookout for these
Yeah.
when you get these disturbances in your woods, because they're just waiting to take advantage of that opening when they can.
Yeah, if you think about, and I don't want to cut in too much here on Dr. McNeil's presentation, but if you think about just from a bird perspective, if I've got a woodland of 40 acres and 5 or 10 acres of it gets, destroyed in a windstorm or something, that's going to, if it's an older growth forest or, maybe 75, 100 years old or something, and then it gets knocked down, that's going to invite early successional birds to come in there, maybe some grassland birds. And so all of a sudden you may have, 60 or 70 species on your property instead of 45 or 50.
Yeah.
And then you can determine what you want to do with that. Do you want to allow it to regrow? Do you like seeing those species on your property and you want to maintain that early successional habitat? That's really, up to the landowner as to what they do. But, looking into best management practices and understanding where you want to shift that trajectory of winners and losers that's based on the habitat structure and the composition is really important. And
And,
then,
I was going to say, John, we'll remind our viewers and listeners that if you're a Kentucky landowner and you have more than 25 acres of land, that the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources can send out wildlife biologists to kind of help you manage your property. They can also advise you. So if that's something of interest to you all as landowners out there, please make sure you're connecting with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, a great group to help you manage for wildlife and deal with some of these extreme events.
there is a question in the chat.
Mhm. Yeah, I
And
saw that.
so it's asking if animals in hibernation come out and it freezes back again, do they go back in? And so let's just take a couple of different species here. Let's take black bear, for example. If when we were working on research on black bears, we tried to time when we would go down there on a cold day. Because even if it warms up into the high 30s or low 40s, black bear are quasi-active, and the female can actually come out of the den. And in some cases, if it gets really warm, she'll come out of the den and then go back in if it gets cold again. So we're in an area where the temperature doesn't get too cold, and so that allows them to kind of play around a little bit with this. They have more room for error, I guess, given how much fat that they've got on their body.
Mhm.
Bats, on the other hand, it's a little bit riskier for them to move out of their hibernacula. And that's because they have to power their body up. So they do shut their body down, but they're much smaller organisms. So and they have a higher metabolism. So when they power their body up to start flying again and come out of a cave, they're going to burn up more relative reserves. And so if they end up going back in because they can't find any food, that's a pretty big drain on their battery.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, no, there's so much we don't know or
I
understand,
know.
or at least me, yeah. Yeah. Dr.
Well,
Cox, thank you again. Really, appreciate having you on and the work you do really kind of, for wildlife here, and especially you're a mammal expert for sure, but thanks for all you do for wildlife. Appreciate it.
All right.
appreciate it.
Thank you all.
All right.
Good stuff. All
Good.
right.
Now
Keeping
we
the good stuff rolling. We've
exactly.
got Dr. DJ McNeil and a special edition of Wings of Kentucky. So looking forward to that.
We asked him to do the same thing from a bird angle. And so we will go ahead and watch that.
All right, I'll get it rolling.
Okay, folks, welcome to another Wings of Kentucky. I'm excited to share with you all today an interesting story about the effects of extreme weather on Kentucky's birds. Now, in this particular case, we're going to talk about birds of Pennsylvania, but we're going to talk about birds that are present in Kentucky as well. So before we dive into that, this little case study that I have for you all, let's just briefly touch on the effects of extreme weather on birds in general. So I have a lovely least tern here, which isn't a particularly common species in Kentucky, but we expect that as climate change occurs, the incidence of extreme weather patterns are going to increase. We're going to have more extreme weather patterns. This could be things like droughts, right, due to increased temperature overall through global warming as it's sort of in its proper form, as well as flooding and rainfall due to, of course, global warming, which is a consequence of climate change, causing increased evaporation and evapotranspiration, causing more water in the atmosphere. So we're going to have increased flooding and rainfall, which is kind of weird, right? They're both extreme rain and extreme droughts, both of which are expected to occur across the world in different parts of the earth in response to climate change. And of course, there are many different ways it can affect birds, and you could have a whole college class on this topic. A classic example would be like flooding on beaches and in rivers to affect like eggs and nests of birds like least terns. a variety of different things. In fact, we're going to talk about one such example today. In fact, I'd like to bring this to a little bit of a personal story rather than sort of a lecture almost, if you will. I'd like to tell a little bit about an experience I had with some of my research colleagues, especially Dr. Cameron Fiss back in 2017. I was a grad student at the time, as was Dr. Fiss. He's at the University of Pittsburgh now. And this was a case study, if you will, about the effects of extreme weather and how that could affect birds. Again, I was a PhD student. The work was in Pennsylvania, as I'll show you, and this really showcases some of the effects of extreme weather on bird populations. Also gives a fun little opportunity to showcase some of the methods we use in ornithology, as well as the characteristics of bird behavior that we use to monitor bird populations and use that information for their conservation. Which brings us to the bird that I was studying at the time. This is the golden-winged warbler, Vermivora chrysoptera. Vermivora means worm eater, and chrysoptera means golden wing. As you can see, the wing is yellow and they don't eat worms. So it's not a particularly good name, but I didn't name it. And one of the well, many interesting things about this species, but one of the reasons why we're studying it is because it's a bird that's been declining in Kentucky. They're doing very, very poorly. There are only a handful of pairs left in the state. And a big part of why they're declining is the loss of early successional forest. And there are other factors too, wintering grounds destruction. So it's a long distance neotropical migrant. So they're losing their wintering grounds in Central and South America. Hybridization with a closely related species called the blue-winged warbler. They undergo or they experience extensive parasitism by the brown-headed cowbird, which kind of acts like the European cuckoos maybe you've seen in like nature documentaries, where they lay their eggs in the nests of the golden-winged warbler, and the golden-winged warblers sort of forced to raise the baby cowbirds. But one of the main factors is the loss of breeding habitat. They nest in early successional forests like clear cuts and regenerating wildfires and things like that. And those types of cover are becoming rarer and rarer on the landscape, which has been a big driving factor for why we've lost golden-winged warbler populations. Now, fortunately, documents like this one here, the Golden-winged Warbler Status Review and Conservation Plan, have provided a lot of information how to restore habitat for golden-winged warblers. And that can look a variety of different ways, but this is one such example. This is what you might call either a clear cut with residuals or an overstory removal, etc. And this is a site managed this one's in Pennsylvania where the work was done for golden-winged warblers. And pretty extensive work has been done monitoring how the golden-winged warbler responds to this effort. So we know that the birds use the sites. We know that they can occur at pretty high densities in these sites. But we also know that the density of birds within these sites can be misleading in certain cases. Sometimes in nature, sites that have the highest density of animals may not have the highest reproductive output, for example. And we've seen a number of times where that's happened. So it's important to assess reproduction in these sites, not just the density of the animals. How well are they doing? How many babies are they having? And one key area where we're very interested in the world of ornithology is fledglings. Historically, ornithologists spent a lot of time focusing only on nests, so we designed a study to look at these fledglings and understand patterns of fledgling survival and ecology in these sites. So the study was done in central and eastern Pennsylvania. So we had one study site here in Center and Clinton County and another site here in Pike and Monroe County, Pennsylvania. So what did we set out to do? Well, we wanted to look at these fledglings. Do they use the managed forests? We know that the adults are nesting in the managed forest, but do the fledglings stay there or do they go somewhere else? Survival rates. Are these babies surviving a long time or do they have really low survival? And behavior. We wanted to know a little bit about what foraging behavior looks like in this species. Now, of course, to do this, we needed to find some nests, right? So how the heck do you find nests for a bird like the golden winged warbler. I mean, these birds nest on the ground and they're in these really dense timber harvests, right, that are full of like brambles and brush, and it's just like it's tough. Like you can't just search every square inch of ground. So how the heck do we find the nests? Well, this is how we find a golden winged warbler's nest. There's a female there and she's got a leaf in her mouth. And there she is going down to the ground in that patch of rubus and goldenrod there. We wait. And there she is coming back out again. And away she goes. And this is what we did day after day. We'd sit there in the sites, we'd watch for female golden-winged warblers and follow them around. And this is what we hope to see. And then if you're not sure, you say, okay, I think she just went into that clump of brush there. I'm going to hold tight and see if she comes back again, because if she's building a nest there, she's going to come back, right? So you just sit put, you don't get too crazy, and you just wait. Spend a lot of time sitting there, watching the vegetation, looking for females, scoping out potential spots, hoping she comes back. Oh, here she is again. Another big old clump of grass or stems, various nesting material. Back into the same spot, clearly building a nest right at the base of that rubus stem. So that's great. So we find nests in that way, and here's a completed golden-winged warbler nest, really quite beautiful, directly on the ground. A bunch of leaves kind of form the outer cluster with grass and increasingly fine grass on the inside. So we monitor these nests every 2 to 3 days, check to see if the nest was still active. More frequent nest checks as the nest was expected to fledge its young. And this is critical to monitor these nests. But after the nest succeeded, we didn't stop there. We wanted to monitor the little fledglings too. So how do you monitor the survival of a fledgling, right? It jumps out of the nest, they're mobile. Well, we put these little miniature radio transmitters with a teeny tiny little leg loop harness. Each of these little loops went around the bird's legs, and the transmitter sat on the bird's back with one loop coming down the left on that leg and the other loop going down the back on the right leg. So was our study successful? Well, what did we find? Well, in terms of habitat selection, we got really great data on that. We found that these fledglings use a wide variety of habitat types, both that early successional forest that the species needs to survive, and a lot of other cover types. This is from one of our papers. We showed, hey, the nesting habitat is also fledgling habitat, but so are these like thick areas of pole timber, or even this more mature upland stand with little gaps and other things too. So we got some really good data on habitat use. Well, what about movement rates? Well, this graph shows how far they moved here on our y-axis and the age on the x-axis. So this is a young fledgling here, moving very little distance, maybe 10, 20 meters a day. But as they got older and older and older, you see that movement rate's going up to the point where they're moving 200, 250 meters every single day. That's like 2.5 to 3 football fields every single day. Survival. Well, what do we find? Well, survival is really low for these little fledglings. In fact, fewer than 50% of them make it to adulthood. It's absolutely crazy how low their survival is. Much more to the story than just the survival of nests. We found that survival of the chicks was really related to age. So this is the age of the fledgling from 0 to 12 plus days. And you can see that survival is really low for these little young ones, and it goes up and plateaus. So they got to survive that first like 3 or 4 days, and then they're usually okay. But man, survival is low for those first few days. And there was regional variation and all of this kind of thing. So a lot of really good data on survival. What about behavior? Well, this was one of the fun parts of the study. We were able to monitor fledglings like this one. You can see it's got a little leg band on and a radio transmitter on. Not much interesting behavior happening here. Well, as the birds aged, they transitioned to a bird like this one that moved around a lot and was foraging all on its own. So did the fledglings learn foraging from their parents? Well, yeah, they did. Here's a little fledgling golden-winged warbler male learning to forage from his father. You can see the father there, the much more colorful one, displaying the foraging behavior and demonstrating it for the fledgling. we saw a lot of this. Little fledgling says, all right, well, I guess dad's not going to feed me. I'm going to have to practice this foraging all on my own. All right, so as fun as this is, we're here to talk about extreme weather, right? So what about extreme weather? Well, on the 30th of May, 2017, in these sites where we were doing this really cool study, we observed an intense isolated hailstorm. And these types of things, they can never be predicted. It's really hard to study, and they just happen randomly, right? With increasing frequency. We had golf ball sized hail, brush vegetation, even big blackberry stems. All the trees were stripped of all their leaves. Honestly, when you got to the site, it smelled like someone had been mowing grass. It was just crazy. The hailstorm happened suddenly and ended within 15 minutes and only affected a single one of our sites. So how did the birds fare in light of this hailstorm? Well, in the site that was affected, we were monitoring 9 nests at the time of the hailstorm. 8 of them failed within that 15-minute period. But that's not a big deal, right? These birds can nest again and try again. Well, that's true. A lot of the nests look like this one here with crushed eggs, and you can see ants feeding on the eggs, eggshells strewn all over. Normally, the birds could re-nest in a time like this, but we also saw 2 females dead outside their nest, just laying there dead, crushed by hail. And we actually, of the 9 pairs, only 2 of the females were ever seen alive again. With this was a 80% reduction in the male and female population within a 15-minute period of time. We were also monitoring some other bird nests. We saw failures in field sparrow and common yellowthroat nests, and we detail all of this in this paper, hail-induced nest failure and adult mortality, and a declining ground nesting forest songbird. So what does this all mean? Well, extreme weather events can impact even small populations of forest birds, potentially hampering the benefits of forest management in this single site. Crazy enough, the other sites in our study area were not affected, no signs of hail in any of them. So these effects can be fairly localized, but we expect this sort of thing to become more common as climate change and its effects become more realized. And one of the cool things is that we're able to document this sort of thing by doing the kind of wildlife research that we do here in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Somewhat of a gloomy outlook here, but of course, sometimes we have to confront these things in wildlife conservation, and I'm going to leave it at that for this Wings of Kentucky. See you next time.
Well, that was very interesting. I didn't even think about hail being an issue. It should be, but because I mean, some of that hail was bigger than their eggs, looks like. So I could see how that would easily do it. But when he showed all those birds, I'm like, oh, maybe half. No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it's quite surprising. So, and it's tough. There's really not much you can do about that, right? Other than trying
Right.
to have, good management going on and trying to have healthy populations that can withstand that and be resilient to this.
Mhm.
Yeah, I really appreciate Dr. McNeil for sharing that story and putting that information together. Yeah, it was really cool.
All right. So for our next guest, we have Chad Nyman. If you want to turn your camera on, Chad, we appreciate you joining us. And you have some information about a conference. And also, the question of mass timber have come up a couple of times, and people are asking us, what is that? So we thought
Right.
we'd have you on and let you get to talking about it.
Thank you so much, Billy and Renee, for
Yeah,
having me on.
good to have you,
And
bud.
some great crossover that I wasn't thinking about prior to listening to Dr. Cox and Dr. McNeil's talks. As I'm presenting from the Robinson Center today, the university's Eastern Kentucky Research Station, which has been a site of a lot of extreme weather events over the last few years. And
Definitely.
so we're right along the North Fork of the Kentucky River here. And as we're talking about resilient structures that have the potential to both impact the value to local communities and wood utilization, uh, there's this need for these resilient structures that can withstand extreme weather and changes in climate, but also help us when we have to build back from those extreme weather events and being able to have something that's more resilient than what we had before. And so a few other good crossovers that I'll talk about in just a moment. But so what is mass timber? We get this question a lot. This is a term that's been around since about 2012. And so it's relatively new. And what we're talking about is essentially large wooden buildings in the most simplest form. But it's a category of engineered wood products, and they're allowing us to use small pieces of wood, either nailed or glued together, to make these large panels. We're talking about like 40-foot long wall and ceiling and floor panels and these glulam beams which support large structures. And so the great benefit of these is extreme strength and stability. The Wood Utilization Center is here at the Robinson Center, and it was built in 1962 and is still actively used today for training and extension programming and teaching to support the university's mission. And so there's a lot of resources available out there. And essentially these with hardwood cross-laminated timber is one area we've been working in a lot since about 2016, 2017, to be able to make these panels that are essentially a super plywood using lumber that's been glued together in these different directions, these opposing directions, what we call orthogonal layers. I know it's a big word, but we're essentially crossing those layers. And so why are we doing this? There's benefits to mass timber. And so we're trying to increase forest management out at the landscape level. So we're working with underutilized species that we don't have markets for, so that those private landowners and large land holdings that we have will have markets to be able to sell those trees into so they can achieve their management objectives. And there is this large carbon storage potential through long-lived wood products. And so we think about how we can make a product where that wood will stay in form for a very long time. There's nothing that competes with structures, as we're able to keep all of that carbon locked up in that building as long as that structure is there in place. And then there's also this term called biophilia. There's these biophilic properties of wood. So it actually reduces our stress. We feel much more comfortable and creative in these spaces that are made out of natural materials. And then just basic electric savings with the insulative properties of wood. And so I always try to throw this slide in here because we know that trees are valuable in so many different ways. And the highest use of those trees is while they're living, conducting photosynthesis, cellular respiration, uptaking stormwater runoff, and providing that food and shelter to birds and small mammals and flowers, and for the pollinators that we have out there, filtering air and water, sheltering us from the summer heat and strong winds. But when we have these trees get to the end of their lifespan, being able to use them in long-lived purposes like our structures is a great way to honor the legacy of these trees, as well as reduce the impact that we have on our environment. And so we have a collaborative Kentucky mass timber group that is taking the charge on these research efforts across campus, and that includes our College of Engineering, Department of Civil Engineering with Dr. Abhitha Paris, College of Design, Architecture, Professor Bruce Swetnam, and myself here in our Martin Gatton College of Agriculture, Food and Environment in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources and Extension. And so we do have this great conference that's coming up here this Friday, and we've got continuing education hours for the Society of American Foresters, professional engineers, AIA for architecture, and we have CURS hours for our county extension agents. As those agents are tied into their communities, we really want them to be a part of this so that they can find ways for public buildings like schools and other structures that we're building all over the Commonwealth that we could be building out of our state tree and other underutilized wood in our state that adds value to our communities and jobs. And so just to quickly show you all the partners involved, and the real driver behind this work is trying to show the difference in our hardwood forest systems from the softwood forests that are typically used in structural purposes. So we've just had a change where our state tree, yellow poplar, has been approved as the first hardwood species into the International Building Code through the standard. And so with that, we have to understand these different forest types, where this wood is coming from, so we can manage them. And so understanding that our hardwood forests, they're these dynamic ecosystems, and succession is driven by disturbance. And so managing forests and woodlands for succession, diversity, and forest health, we're not wanting to have monoculture systems, we're wanting to have these natural systems that we allow to grow, understanding threats to forest health, trees, and ecosystem function. And so to really broaden that out to the entire Commonwealth, we created the first high school curriculum for forestry. And so it's been approved through the Kentucky Department of Education. And that way, high school students and teachers across Kentucky can learn more about the forests and related career paths, as well as products that we make from our forests and the benefits of that. Because we know that forest products improve our health and reduce our impact on the environment. And as we go forward with technology advancements, we really are entering into a new industrial revolution, and the growth and development of this are moving at such a rapid pace that it's very challenging just to keep up with the new advancements in technology that are happening daily. And with that, we're able to work with wood in ways that we have not previously been able to. We've got optimization equipment and technology that, when it's paired with skilled employees, that we can manufacture wood products more efficiently than ever before. And so there's so many benefits to human environmental health, from plant production and management to sustainability, financial security and economic well-being, connected and resilient communities, health and well-being, small farm development. Most of our woodlands are owned by small families. And then there's the mental health and well-being that's tied to biophilia. And in this background, I've put a mass timber structure, which is Breathitt County High School's basketball gymnasium. So it's right down the road here, and it's a mass timber structure, showing some of that precedent that we've gotten in our state to show for examples of what mass timber can look like. And so these resilient mass timber structures can be really large. This is an example here of Brock Commons Tallwood House. And there was a study that was recently conducted with buildings as a global carbon sink. And so we know that there is this enormous potential. We're talking gigatons of carbon that we could be storing and locking up in those buildings. And so why this is so important is because building construction accounted for 37% of our global CO2 emissions in 2012. And we know with the trajectory that this is ever increasing, and it is due to the intensive materials that go in. Concrete and steel are always going to be important building materials, but this allows us to use those in the most critical locations in the buildings, and using renewable wood to build most of the structure and reduce that impact. And so we need to locally produce mass timber using our local forest resource. This allows us to develop new innovative structural products from local hardwood trees. And that way we can have more resilient offices, apartments, schools, gymnasiums, and other large structures. And using hardwoods creates new markets for these farmers and woodland owners so they can manage their timber. And with that takes a lot of education with architects, engineers, foresters, wood product researchers, building code officials, county extension agents, and industry. And so just to think about why this is so significant, as we live in a state where nearly half of the land surface is in forest, and with our largest agricultural sector being the forest sector, that contributes right now $19 billion and supports our $9 billion bourbon industry, we really need to ensure that we're able to manage those forests for succession in the future, so that the nearly 60,000 Kentuckians employed in that sector continue to benefit, and we can add more jobs in that renewable sector. Each of the dots on this map is a wood industry, and due to the lack of wood consumption that we have in this nation, we are losing those wood industries, including our largest facility in Southeast Kentucky that was utilizing about 43 million board feet of lumber a year. And due to not having enough markets, they had to close their operation, and we've lost several others. And this graph here by the Hardwood Market Report just shows that drop off of consumption. 1999 was our high point of hardwood consumption in the United States. And you can see the 08-09 recession really negatively impacted that declining consumption due to the economic hardship, people being able to afford hardwood products. But there is also these lesser expensive non-renewable materials. So you think of a lot of plastic flooring and other non-renewable products that people are using as alternative substitutions instead of hardwoods. And so simply we're not using enough wood, which if we look here at Kentucky's growth through removals, we can see this green column is how much that we're growing in an average year. And the red is what is dying from insects, disease, and old age. And the blue here is what we're harvesting out there in the woods. So you can see that with mortality and removals combined, we're still growing twice as much annually out there in the forest. So still a lot of opportunity to sustainably harvest more timber from those forests. And with wood being our oldest and most sustainable building material, when we pair it with sustainable forest management and new technology, we're able to build healthy, sustainable spaces. And just tying this into this White Oak Initiative for the ecological and economic purposes, we know that there is this recognized oak bottleneck, this issue with being able to get advanced regeneration and competition issues for our oak seedlings out there and saplings. And so being able to get shelterwood harvests out on the landscape to provide the right light environment so that that regeneration can be able to grow. And that takes markets for underutilized hardwood species to be able to drive that. And this US Forest Service map just shows this range of our white oak forests, which shows pretty closely to the central hardwoods forest region of which Kentucky's in the heart of. And then tying into what Dr. McNeil was talking about with our need for early successional forests, you can see these blue columns here. This goes back to 2004. And you can see that we have a very mature, very large diameter forest out there, and a little bit of medium diameter and very little small diameter. And this would be your early successional forest type. And so for those golden wing warblers, as Dr. McNeil was talking about, we really need to be able to have this succession and harvesting, utilizing that mature forest. So these benefits from hardwood cross-laminated timber market development is managed local forests and improved forest health, markets for local wood and carbon storage, and the construction sector has gone to a very prefabricated construction model. And so this ties directly into the momentum of the construction sector in faster, more efficient, and healthier buildings. So just to dive in a little bit onto some of our past work that we've done on compressive properties of underutilized hardwood CLT panels, we knew that yellow poplar was in the works of being approved into the PRG 320 standard. And we wanted to be able to work on other underutilized species that would be able to augment. So we weren't just targeting yellow poplar. We had other species that could be used in cross-laminated timber panels. And the three species that we worked with first were red maple, sweet gum, and sycamore. And so we wanted to test what these properties had for compression, for overall strength values. And this is driven by the need for these markets for underutilized hardwoods. There was a SOAR study that was conducted back in 2015 that said an additional 4.9 billion of industry contribution could be received through this management and utilization of these types of underutilized species. And so we know that that impact is only increased in the changes we've seen in our economy in recent years. But three very nice appearance species. And so you think about the interior of a structure, this being the finish, having sweet gum, red maple, or sycamore. And so what we did was we made test panels, working with our engineering partners and architecture partners. Over in the civil engineering lab, we were able to actually destructively test these panels, looking at the compressive strength and the point of failure for these different sized panels. And what we found, you can see the red maple is the red column here, the sycamore is the blue, sweet gum is the green, and southern yellow pine is the yellow. And so for both compressive stress and elastic modulus, the southern yellow pine was the weakest of all of those species tested, and about 3 times stronger strength for all 3 of those hardwood species, sweet gum having a lot of compressive strength. And so lots of promise and feasibility for these hardwood species, which has potential for it to be competitive in the marketplace. So we've got this great conference coming up Friday. We did have a SWOT analysis from our small group discussions. I wanted to just briefly talk about those different breakout groups and some of the findings we had from that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats discussion that we had. So we had a forestry and wood industry group, a society and economy, design and architecture, engineering and education groups. We found a lot more strengths than we did the other categories. We have abundant, sustainably managed forests and abundant wood availability in our region, the beauty and appearance of hardwoods, the bending strength properties of hardwoods, these naturally regenerated forest systems, lower moisture content standard of operation within the hardwood industry currently, and low carbon or carbon positive structures through use of local wood. The fact that we have a very strong aerospace and high-tech job sector within our industries in our region, an adaptive and strong workforce, and there is this need to address climate and changes in climate. And then there's the benefits generally from mass timber with strong fire ratings and the charring that you have in those panels. And there is a lot of strong educational resources available on the engineering side. So with weaknesses, a lot of hardwood species are more valuable. And so that's where the species that we were targeting were ones that we knew could be competitive, as there isn't other markets that are using that. Things like variable widths of lumber, the fact that moisture leaves our hardwood species at a slower rate than our softwood species. And a big one is the educational cultural stigma around wood use and a need to destigmatize that. That was especially strong in the architectural and engineering communities. And there is a need for more demonstration mass timber structures, the fact that code officials do not often know about mass timber and its opportunities. And so there's also a need for marketing that ties directly into that. And so with opportunities, mass timber being within the International Building Code under the standard ANSI APA PRG 320, which is a big term there, but that's the standard for cross-laminated timber. And that we do have a sustainable logging supply currently with enough loggers to be able to provide the material and opportunities to manage forests at a landscape level. And another big opportunity is the world is running out of angular sand. There's only so much, and concrete being used in the most vital locations, we can be able to conserve some of that angular sand. And Wood Innovations grant funding was another big opportunity, as well as advancing wood technology. And with these resilient structures, you look at different tornadic and seismic events and fires. There is a lot of resilience built into these strong structures, and demand for mass timber is far outpacing supply. We're actually importing most of this from Europe across the ocean. So the big threats that were identified was not enough markets for low-grade material, addressing climate resilience is not always politically palatable, and other material lobby groups are actually working to suppress mass timber advancement. So another study that we have tied to this was a multi-state study where we were taking these large squares from the heart of logs called cants, and we were finding ways to efficiently saw structural lumber from them. In collaboration with Virginia Tech, this was supported by a Wood Innovations grant, and we had support from Terman Lumber Company in Virginia to conduct that work. So in the future, we're going to continue advancing testing on additional hardwood species for use in mass timber and approval of underutilized hardwood species into HCLT, hardwood cross-laminated timber. So hope that you can attend our Mass Timber in Appalachia conference this Friday. And we've got a QR code here to go to the web page. You can find more information about mass timber at kymasstimber.com. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chad. We appreciate that. We really do. And we do have several questions, just so you know. Um, so let's see. One was, how toxic or non-toxic is this wood product if the building burns? Like versus like an untreated 2x4 or something like that.
Well, that's the great thing about these products is they currently are not a treated product. You could use a very safe thing like borates, so it'd be equivalent to having a brush pile burning, to this structure. And with good fire suppression systems, you think sprinklers that you have in any building required by law, you have protection for that structure. And due to the fact that these large panels, they char, they don't actually burn. So there is huge fire protection in that as well.
Nice. Okay. All right. Also, understanding that it's a two human generation from harvest, but how would you rate planting white oak or red oak versus yellow poplar?
So that is one of the really cool things I think about our hardwood forests is that we don't have to plant very often. There are some places like an old field where you may want to add some oak component into that by doing some planting.
Mhm.
But I always like to promote diversity, and I know our department is big on having a diversity of tree species out there. So even if you were going to plant some oaks, you should plant some other species in there, like yellow poplar, and that whole broad diversity.
Yeah, and Chad, if you don't mind, I'll add on to that. If you are a woodland owner and you're having those questions like about planning or managing, please reach out to a natural resource professional. We have foresters with the Kentucky Division of Forestry, service foresters that are available to meet with you one-on-one, assess your property, develop a management plan for you, and really tailor the management to your property, your objectives, and what's best for that land. So I would strongly encourage you, check out the Kentucky Division of Forestry. They have people that can help you make those decisions in a very informed way.
Mhm.
Thank you.
That's a very good plug, Billy. And I think all of those professionals would tell them to plant native species. And a
Mhm.
little plug for our great nurseries that we have in the state through the Kentucky Division of Forestry. And so wonderful resources that we have there. Thank
So
you.
one more question. What
Yes.
percentage of Kentucky is old growth forest and how is that affected by harvesting?
That's a great question. And so when you think of what is like truly virgin forest, never been touched, that's a very small proportion. I think it's like what, 2,000 acres in the whole state approximately. And you
Yeah,
think of lily cornet woods
stuff, but yes, it's very, 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 very small.
and then when we get into the definition of like this old growth, that's, a lot of folks think about that as a couple hundred years old. And those systems, they are a bit different. You think about Robinson Forest, it's a second growth forest. It is right over 100 years old from the time it was harvested. And so that system functions a little bit differently than something that's, fourth or fifth time harvested. But, you know, looking at the non-native invasive plants coming in is always an important component in managing any type of forest system. And Dr. Crocker is a wealth of information along with our partners at the Division of Forestry.
So,
Definitely.
folks, come join us at the Mass Timber Conference if your schedule permits. Chad, I don't know if you want to flash that
Yes,
barcode up maybe one more time. So get your phones out, get ready, and scan this.
Yeah, if you want to learn a whole lot, we have a great lunch. Taco bar going to be there, so you don't have to bring lunch, and it's going to be an awesome day.
there we go.
All right, there you go. Grab your phones, hit the clicker, go.
Open,
Absolutely. We would
open your
love to
photo
have you be
app,
a
and there
part
you
of the
go.
conversation.
Yeah, and if you're a podcast listener, YouTuber, kymasstimber.com.
We're bringing in some of our partners from Virginia Tech, some incredible Dr. Hindeman and Dr. Larasati, and we'll have it's our regional representative for Woodworks, so they're going to be sharing some of the engineering resources briefly, but then we've got one of our own graduate students, Miss Vane Onyongo, who's going to be giving a Kentucky-specific timber supply report and economic study. And we've got Stephen Rogers with the Kentucky Division of Forestry, who's going to give more of a regional analysis and sustainability overview. So much for everyone, every different type of person. We've really tried to make this have a component for every type of person. And we're going to have folks from the Kentucky Building Code Committee, as they're very interested in how they can integrate this into Kentucky's building code.
Wonderful.
So exciting.
A
Yeah.
lot of good stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I can't thank you enough for all the great work you've been doing for a long time here. And this is really a really cool event. So I hope everybody will take advantage of this unique opportunity.
And Billy and I will
All
be there.
That's right. I appreciate you all helping to showcase this. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Chad. We appreciate you being on, and I'm sure we'll have you on in future shows.
No doubt.
Look forward to it. Everyone have a great afternoon.
All right. See you, buddy. Thank you. All right, Renee, we covered a lot of ground.
A lot of ground, right? Greatly appreciate all of our guests for joining us today, and we appreciate you because we couldn't do it without you. That's for sure.
Just each other then, right? You know,
Right, exactly. So I'll go to fromthewoodstoday.com if you have any suggestions for future shows, or you just want to watch this one again. Hopefully within a day it'll be popped up there. So just go ahead and do that. And also you can get a little survey thing that tells, gives some depth into maybe what you're seeing into your woods. Maybe there's a picture you want to share with us. You can do that there as well.
yes, yes. Holler anytime. Let us know what you all want to see or what's happening in your woods, because it's probably happening in somebody else's too.
Exactly. Until then, we will see you all next week. So take care. Bye.
Buddy.
From the woods today. From the woods today.